Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Suleiman the Magnificent Part 4, The Shadow of God by Extra History. Now last time we saw how Suleiman both reformed the laws of the Ottoman Empire and also defeated the Hungarians in battle. Pretty impressive stuff. Today we'll see how his reign as Sultan continues. Now if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
As he watched the guard change stations, he remembered that victory on the Mohacs Plain, and why it had been important for another reason. Just before he'd gone on campaign, an envoy had arrived at his court from the Queen Mother of France. The envoy had dropped to a knee before him and begged him to attack Charles, that Spanish prince, so that he would release her prince, the King of France, who Charles had captured in one of their wars over Italy.
I think I mentioned in a previous episode that the French were the first of these sort of Western European countries who actually made an alliance with the Ottomans. So here we are seeing the beginning of that, right? And this is all down to geopolitics. The Ottomans present a threat to the enemies of the French. Mainly, we're talking about the Habsburgs in Austria, but some of the other regional power players as well. And so the French and the Ottomans, they share some enemies. And so perhaps it's time to make an alliance, right? Which shows you that, of course, religion plays a role in all of this, but it's not quite so black and white. And so we see the beginning of that French-Ottoman alliance here.
This had pleased Suleiman. He had already planned his campaign toward the Mohawks. He would fulfill this request without actually changing plans. But there was more than that. This was his road into the circles of European diplomacy.
Yeah.
His predecessors had only ever been adversaries to the European world, but he knew that if he was ever to have his European empire, he would need allies there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when you look at this map of Europe, you can see at this point that the Ottoman Empire should be a serious player in European geopolitics. They now occupy a lot of land in southeastern Europe, the Balkans, and they're even sort of reaching into Central Europe, right? The Ottomans control a lot of territory. They are, really the greatest empire of this region, but they're definitely at least competing with these European countries within Europe itself. Right, so the Ottomans want a seat at the table. Suleiman realizes, as was pointed out, if he wants the Ottoman Empire to have a sustainable position, to be able to last for a long time, they can't be adversaries and enemies of everybody. They do need to make some alliances, right, which the Ottomans could do. Of course, they're best known for expanding through warfare, but it wasn't entirely warfare with the Ottomans. Diplomacy was important to them as well, and that's what we're seeing here. And we're seeing some of that diplomacy occurring with France in particular.
But he knew that if he was ever to have his European empire, he would need allies there, and this was his route to them. But the next major envoy to him after the Battle of Mohacs was not one of friendship. It was from Ferdinand, that other Habsburg who Charles had given his Austrian lands to so that he could concentrate on his Spanish holdings. As soon as Ottoman forces had pulled back from Hungary, Ferdinand had swept in. The envoys were...
Yeah, well, at this point, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans are sort of fighting over this same border territory, which in this case, what we're talking about is Hungary, right? This is a territory that both the Habsburgs, the Austrian Habsburgs, and the Ottomans are sort of encroaching on from different directions, so not great for the Hungarians either way. You've got both of these sort of powerful empires on either side of you, and so the Ottomans pull back a little bit, the Habsburgs move in, and, the same vice versa. So they're really competing for influence over the same territory.
There to assert Ferdinand's claim to the region. They were masked as overtures of peace, but the discussion was a disaster. The Habsburg envoys asked for all the fortified parts of Hungary to be handed over in exchange for peace, and Ibrahim responded, why not ask for Istanbul as well? It wasn't really going well. Needless to say, no agreement was reached, and shortly thereafter, Ferdinand declared himself King of Hungary, while the Hungarians themselves elected a local noble named John Sapolia to be their king. Suleiman...
Yeah, this is an issue that would continue, really, through the 19th century. this issue between the Hungarians and, well, the Habsburgs, the Austrian Habsburgs in particular. Now, of course, Hungary will become a pretty significant part of the Austrian Empire, and then eventually you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's all very complicated, but you've got a lot of rivalry and problems here between the Habsburgs and the Hungarians.
Suleiman would have to head back to Hungary to reestablish control. This time, there would be no stopping. He would head all the way to Vienna, that great Habsburg stronghold in the east. He once again raised the horsetail banners and summoned the endless legions of his empire. 100,000 strong, they would march back into Europe. He would serve as a supreme commander with Ibrahim at his side. On the 10th of May, 1592, they departed for their grand campaign.
Yeah, and Vienna has perhaps taken on an outsized importance in all of this, just because of what it sort of came to represent to both sides, right? The furthest extent of Ottoman expansion, where they were stopped, essentially. But even if we detach from that a little bit, Vienna is, of course, important. It is the stronghold of the Habsburgs, the Austrian Habsburgs in this case. It really would have been a point from which the Ottomans could have expanded further throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Vienna was one of the more important cities of continental Europe at this point. So it was definitely an important city. Once again, maybe not as important as our sort of idea of it today, right? Given everything that's associated with the Ottomans and Vienna, and how much of a historical reputation all of this has taken on, but it definitely was important.
But again, weather plagued them. Rain poured unceasingly. His camels faltered, his men fell ill, his great cannon would get mired in the road, and even with hundreds of men and dozens of beasts trying to move them, in the end they had to be abandoned. It wasn't until the 18th of August that he once again reached the Mohacs Plain, where he was met by the upstart Prince Zapolya. But here, at least, things began well. Zapolya paid him homage and joined his forces to that of the empire, helping to retake nearby fortresses. He was glad to accept the suzerainty of Suleiman for help against Ferdinand.
I mean, Zapolya's playing politics here, right? You know, the Ottomans are a power player in the region, and so if you're Zapolya, you want to get, well, your power, right? Your position in one way or another. You might try to play both sides off each other.
Ambassador for the King of France had also arrived with 40,000 crowns to support Zapolya in his attempt to wrest Hungary from the Habsburgs. Together, they all traveled to Buda, which Ferdinand had occupied in the absence of Ottoman forces. The siege lasted only 6 days. The Janissaries carried the town by storm. Suleiman forbade the town from being sacked, as the Hungarians were now his subjects, but that didn't stop his men from taking many slaves, and though they mostly left the Hungarians alone, it didn't prevent them from separating as many Austrian heads as they could from their Austrian necks. Soon, Zapolya was installed as ruler there, and
So, I mean, still brutality there, right? As with all forms of warfare at this time. But we can see with the, at least attempt not to sack, that, you know, Suleiman's thinking about the future. He's made this alliance with Zapolya. He's thinking about a future in which the Ottomans control all of this territory. And so he's sort of thinking, all right, maybe we don't want to start off with us sacking the most important city in this region if I want to then conquer and rule this territory for the years to follow. Now, not to say the Ottomans didn't do that. There were plenty of cities they sacked and then went on to rule, but it does show you that Suleiman's thinking really like a conqueror, which, of course, is what he was.
Suleiman's men could march for their real objective, Vienna, the seat of Ferdinand himself. By the 27th of September, they reached the walls of the Habsburg town. Within stood 20,000 defenders against his more than 100,000 men under arms. The 72 Habsburg cannon would have to match against his 300. Even Ferdinand had abandoned his capital and fled to Bohemia. Victory looked inevitable. This time, though, the Ottoman threat was all too real for the rest of the Holy Roman Empire to ignore. Charles had sent skilled mercenaries to aid his brother, and even the Protestants were willing to make common cause with their Catholic foes to hold off the Muslim Turks. And the rains had cost him. The Austrians had taken the time to prepare the capital for war. The stores were replenished, the walls were repaired and restored. Even the houses outside the walls had been demolished to keep them from being of use to the besieging army.
I mean, look, the Ottomans have reached Vienna, prepared to siege it. right? So, people understand the significance of this. This is a big moment. The Habsburgs are managing to get some allies from far to come and aid them, because a lot of these other European powers and institutions are concerned about what's going to happen if the Ottomans manage to take Vienna. I mean, the Ottomans have shown so far they are a very powerful force that really continues to expand, and at this moment, nobody knows the extent of that expansion.
The gates were blocked, and firefighting supplies had been prepared. There would be no immediate surrender to the overwhelming army of the Porte. It would be a contest of will and arms, and the cannons began to sing. He watched from his tent on the hill as his men assailed the walls in waves, the 1,000 different costumes of the different ranks making a glorious display against the cold stone of the Viennese walls. Waves would crash and break against that gray shore, always so close to overwhelming the Austrian land, only to pull back out to sea again. Sappers mined the walls. A foolish sortie was broken, and the heads of the reckless Austrians were displayed before the very gates to let them know of the fate that awaited them, to remind them of the hopelessness of their stand. He promised his men great rewards for assaulting the town, with a king's ransom for the first man to get over the wall. And on the 14th of October, his men assailed the walls with the fury of men possessed. They threw themselves upon a breach made by his sappers, carving through the defenders with their vicious curved blades. Inch by inch, they hewed their way forward, nearing the crest of the breach. Then, collapse. The very flower of the Turkish infantry had broken upon the rocks of Vienna.
Look, I mean, the Austrians here are greatly, greatly outnumbered, but as we know, you can defend a fortress, or a city in this case, with less men than it takes to go on the offense, right? So the Austrians were putting up quite the fight here, quite the defense of their city.
And it began to snow.
I mean, not to mention, I know we talked about the weather. We're about to get to the weather again, but that rain, a lot of those guns, the artillery guns getting stuck in the mud, that definitely had an impact on the result of this siege. So you don't want to downplay the impact of the climate, of the weather, and we're getting more of that here.
Suleiman knew it was the end. He paid his men as if it had been a victory, and gave his commanders all victory gifts. He had it proclaimed that he had merely wished to meet Charles and Ferdinand in battle, and that it had never been his intention to capture Vienna. So to spare both his men and the Austrians the privations of a siege, he would happily withdraw.
I mean, that is copium. I mean, this man really wanted to capture Vienna, but you got to at least try to keep up appearances, I suppose.
But in his heart of hearts, he knew this would be the farthest they would ever go. Not just him or his army, but his empire.
Well, I mean, I don't know if he knew that. That would be pretty crazy if he knew that. I mean, frankly, at this time, though the Ottomans are turned back from Vienna, this is why I say, this maybe has sort of outsized importance in our historical memory. It wasn't like this was the end for the Ottomans. Everybody knew they were done. No, the Ottomans were still a present and very real threat to these European powers we've been talking about. It was very possible that the Ottomans would, even after this, continue to expand even further into Europe, right? So, I know we see this as an important moment, and it was, but, I don't think this is what made it impossible for the Ottomans to continue expanding. Now, of course, we know the Ottomans will make it back to Vienna again. More than a century later, there'll be another siege of Vienna, which is perhaps even looms larger in the historical memory than this one, because that truly was the sort of last, the furthest extent and the last chance at the Ottomans conquering the city, going further into Europe. So they'll try it again, even after this. So it might over-exaggerate it a little bit to be like, this is when he knew that the Ottomans would never go further than this. I don't think anybody knew that at this point. I mean, maybe some people thought that, but it would have seemed pretty unlikely that the Ottoman advance would have been stopped at this point.
He could feel it in his bones. To the world and to himself, he smiled and laughed off this one minor setback to the power of the greatest nation in the world. But deep within, he could feel an end surrounding him in the snowy fields of Vienna.
I don't know, because, I mean, look, I would say it's more than a minor setback, but honestly, at this time, I'd say it would be closer to a minor setback than something absolutely disastrous. because after this, the Ottomans continued to be a very powerful empire, right? It's not like things crumbled for them after this. This was not a sign of the end. At least, I don't think it was. I think that would be assigning this far more influence than it really had, even though it's a moment that people like to talk about and perhaps assign that importance to.
As they withdrew, at Buda, Zapolya kissed his ring and congratulated him on a successful campaign. But the entire way, the Austrians harassed his retreating columns, and the weather was cruel company, slowing their march, bringing frostbite and disease. But even as his men fell, his mind was on another sort of ending. For generations, it had been the law of the empire that, upon ascension of a new sultan, all of the sultan's brothers who yet lived would be put to death to prevent civil war.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this in previous episodes that, having potential successors to the throne would be a serious challenge to your own authority, a risk. And so within the Ottoman Empire, your brothers, they would be killed. Now, the Ottomans were not entirely unique in this respect. Other empires would do similar things. For example, the Byzantines, if there was a potential challenger or successor to the throne, usually the emperor might maim them, or send them to a monastery or something like that, or perhaps even kill them. But to be honest, execution is a pretty extreme response. Some empires did do that. A lot of empires use slightly less extreme measures, like sending them to go serve in a monastery for the rest of their life, or maiming them, which is still horrible. But yeah, with the Ottomans, these people would actually be killed.
Were he to die, his sons would have to fight for the throne. The lives of those who lost would be forfeit, even if they survived the struggle. He loved his sons too much, even Mustafa, with whom he struggled at times, to allow that to happen. And what of his love, Roxolana? His heart ached at the thought of her bereft of her sons, but he knew they would lose. Mustafa was his eldest, born to his first wife. He was loved by the people and the army. He was also the most able of his children. He was the clear choice for the future of the empire, but his rise would mean the murder of the children of the ones Suleiman loved the most. On the long road to Istanbul, Suleiman could find no solution. He could only feel the vice of his choice closing around him. He could feel the salt trace down his cheek in the warm breeze that blew over the Bosphorus. How had he let it all go so wrong? He knew as he walked the palace grounds that in the thoughts of the past he would not find peace. And yet, what else was left to an old man? He wondered if that Roman emperor ever shared such thoughts near the end.
This is very interesting that they keep making these comparisons to Justinian. I mean, I absolutely see the parallels in some of these cases, though I'm not sure it's the closest comparison they've ever drawn. And, I mean, I've said this before in this series, they're definitely talking a lot about his sort of personal thoughts and experiences, which I guess is fair, but it's a little bit of a strange approach for me. And it does make me wonder, and I've asked this before, about what sources they're drawing from in particular, because you need some pretty personal sources to actually get a lot of this information they're telling us about. So definitely an interesting approach to the character of Suleiman.
What he wouldn't give to talk to a man who might understand. But they were all dead now, and he was alone. And even that thought brought other memories.
Okay, well, an interesting end to the episode. In this one, we saw the Siege of Vienna, which ended up not being successful. Look, once again, I do think they overstated the case a little bit, the importance of this, and I would be surprised. I mean, look, I'm sure Suleiman did not like how things went, and I'm not saying this was a great triumphant moment for the Ottomans. It wasn't, but I mean, and maybe there's sources that will back up what they were saying. I would be surprised to learn that Suleiman saw this moment as, oh, well, it's all over. I'd be shocked if he viewed it that way. Because, sure, the Austrians celebrated this and all that type of stuff, but this failed siege of Vienna, this did not make everybody less scared of the Ottomans. Not really. They were still worried that the Ottomans would continue to expand, and the Ottomans were still a very real and very serious threat. So, I don't know. I think the sort of failure of the Siege of Vienna in this case is a bit overstated, in my opinion. But, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think down below. If you enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and that Patreon will give you access to a whole bunch of exclusive reactions. Now, with all of that, I hope you guys are having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.